Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. This month, we'll explore the relationships between religious values and public policy. We'll focus especially on budget priorities and how we treat poor people. The program also will include some issues raised in Jim Wallis's highly acclaimed book, God's Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It. We have 4 guests with interesting viewpoints, and collectively we'll all contribute a lot to the discussion. It'll be a very interesting show. I'm happy to welcome Crystal Lorentzson. Crystal's in her last year at the Evergreen State College. She has a strong background in social justice issues and is an intern with Olympia's Welfare Rights Organizing Coalition, ROC. ROC is an organization of low-income parents and allies fighting for better welfare policy at the local and state level. I'm happy to welcome Sam Hochstatter. Sam retired after serving 10 years as minister of Olympia's First Baptist Church. For nearly 2 years, he generously opened his church so homeless people could sleep inside. First Baptist also started a Sunday afternoon dinner program that is still continuing. And he recently taught a class on Jim Wallis's book, God's Politics. Emily Lardner is here. She's a member of St. Michael's Catholic Church and a member of that parish's Just Faith group. She also has a background with Quakers and lived 12 years in a Quaker community in Michigan. She serves on the board of Bread and Roses and has been working to end the Iraq War and change budget priorities through the local Bringing It Home series. And Jerry Smith, our 4th guest, Jerry has served on the Bread and Roses board and has done a lot of other work for poor people and homeless people in our community. He belongs to the First United Methodist Church in Olympia. Jerry took Sam's class on God's Politics and now is co-chairing a study group on this book at his own church. Welcome. It's great to have this array of talent here. It'll be a good hour. Let's begin by looking at what we've been observing in the political and cultural climate that we live in here. How would you summarize the U.S.'s recent and current trend of having so-called religious values affecting public policies, and what examples and influences are you seeing?
Well, I have found, Glenn, that it has stimulated a lot of comments cross-culturally, particularly from the church. I grew up in the situation that we stayed with the separation of church and state, but I find now that there's a good deal of conversation between the various churches and the political issues of today, and I think it is a very healthy issue.
Other takes on what's been happening?
Internationally, I think there's a perception that the Bush administration has called itself Christian and is acting in the world in the name of Christianity in a way that is an anathema to other people who hold Christian values. An example of that is the way Pat Robertson, with all of his full Christian identity, called for the assassination of Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, as if that was good Christian practice. So there's a real scary alignment publicly of what it means to be a Christian and practices that are contradictory to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Glenn, that's why I think his book is, Wallis's book is so essential, is because most of the media catches the Robertsons and the Jerry Falwells, and I think there's a whole host of people like myself that's neither extreme right or extreme left. How do we get our values listened to and heard and understood? I feel that in the 2004 election, I was completely ignored. And I'm asking the question, how can I reverse that? What needs to be done? And in reading Jim Wallis's book, I found that he was a person who was very balanced in his approach to the political issues and faith practices of today.
Yeah, it seems as though the news media will take that stereotypical view, the Falwell approach and the Jerry Robert or the Pat Robertson approach,
Yeah.
and they'll have that be the religious
Yeah.
voice without regard to the fact that there's such diversity, not only Christian but other faiths as well. So it's also not only do they pick the right wing and say that represents all of Christianity, but they take that one right wing of Christianity and that's the religious voice regardless of all the other faiths that are out there as well.
Yes.
So it's just
Yes.
that's why we need to do this program here and get some other views out here. Part of the program here we'll be looking at budget priorities, and part of the program will be looking at how we work with poor people, how our society deals with poor people as examples of values. And Emily, you've been working on budget priorities for some time. What are you seeing in the way of trends overall in federal budget?
I think everybody's seeing the trend. If we're watching the budget, the federal budget is not that complicated. There's money that comes in for taxes and there's money that goes out for social programs. And the big trend with this administration is reduce the amount of taxes that come in and also then reduce the amount that goes back out for social programs. Never mind what we are actually spending money on, like a debt, like growing military. So the trend is to gut social services in the name of some kind of deficit reduction. And I know Crystal's going to talk more about that later, but that's the trend.
Yeah, and the deficit reduction rhetoric doesn't pertain to the military spending.
No.
Or to tax breaks for extremely rich people.
Right.
So it's like.
Right, it's a fake, it's a false situation.
So, Crystal, in the aspect of the federal budget that affects poor people, what have you been seeing?
I would first just add to what Emily said and say that these cuts have been going on for a lot longer since this administration. It's a trend from 1980s and even before that.
Yeah.
But yeah, right now the Congress just passed their budget for 2006. That includes $50 billion of cuts over the next 5 years in social services, including food stamps, child care, financial aid, and increases work requirements for welfare recipients.
And this, my understanding is that $50 billion in cuts just kind of rolled through without adequate debate in Congress or debate among the American people.
Yeah, it was really kind of, my understanding is that their reason for kind of stashing this away in the budget bill is that it wouldn't be looked at with as much speculation as if it was passed separately. And so there's 70 some odd pages in this bill describing these cuts, and there was no scrupulation from the media or anyone for that matter.
Well, let's look at the welfare programs that are federally funded. And there you have what's known as the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which is a mouthful, which is the basic welfare law now for families. So tell us what that's about.
Okay, well that's Personal Responsibility, Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act is welfare reform. That's what Clinton did in 1996 that capped the length of time that you could get welfare, put a 5-year time limit, and made work requirements for welfare recipients. So now in order to get your welfare grant, which is called the TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, you have to fulfill a certain number of hours a week of job search or work requirement. So those were the two big changes that happened for that.
I've always been annoyed by the title because it's personal responsibility, as if poor people aren't responsible unless the government forces them to act responsibly. I mean, it just the name as well as the content is just so demeaning.
Yeah.
I just find it really offensive. So how does that work then? I mean, some of the work requirement was supposed to include, or you could be offset by getting education or training. So what are the realities of that and what's happening nowadays?
The reality is that it's really, really difficult to get education and training while you're on welfare. You're supposed to be able to. It's in the law. It says that, given these stipulations, you should be able to go to school and have it complete your work requirement while you're on welfare. But for a number of reasons, everywhere from the way that caseworkers administer the policies to quotas that the caseworkers are under pressure to be following at the office, people are not always informed of their ability to do that, and it's really difficult.
The part of the federal funding now is pumping money into pressuring women to get married. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that the budget that was passed also included more funding for programs that encourage women to get married. That's a messed up idea in its own right, but on top of it, the programs don't include any awareness or they don't recognize that there could be a domestic violence issue or any kind of problems that might arise from really forcing people into that.
So if the woman has a child and the child's father had been abusive or violent, there's still sort of the pressure to get married.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the trend has been getting worse over quite a number of years. And you had mentioned when you talked on the phone to prepare for the program, you mentioned that the grants have not been increased for 13 years.
That's true. In this state.
So in Washington. So tell us what that dollar amount is.
In Washington State, the welfare grant for a 3-person family is $546 a month, which is 40% of the poverty level. The poverty level being the amount that's absolutely minimum for a person to get their basic needs met.
Now, in Washington State, the work requirements are under a program called Work First, and you told me before the program that Governor Gregoire had looked at the Work First program, and she was evaluating some cuts that had been proposed, and she implemented some, but not all of them. And some of the cuts, some of the pressure that seems to be coming down ends up causing people to be sanctioned, penalized monetarily. Tell us what sanctions are and what kinds of things can cause a family to be sanctioned.
Okay, so when you're on welfare, you have to participate in the Work First program in order to receive your grant. If you don't have full participation, which means you miss a meeting, you show up late to an appointment that you had, they can sanction you, which means they take away part of your grant. That's how it works.
Okay, now. There's some changes that were possible. As to how much gets taken away and whether how much money is cut.
Yeah, so Governor Gregoire in this last month looked at some recommendations from a Work First reevaluation committee. They had a list of about 5 or 6 recommendations of cuts that they wanted to make. The only one that she passed was what's called full family sanctions, which means that instead of getting a portion of your welfare grant cut, you will get your entire grant taken away. And
for what kinds of things might cause that to happen? You mentioned like missing a meeting or being late for an appointment.
Yeah, exactly. And in the Washington state law, there's a list of good excuses to miss an appointment or to not fulfill what you've the things in your independent responsibility plan. And if you don't have childcare, if you don't have transportation, if you have a medical issue, et cetera, these are all good reasons not to be sanctioned for missing an appointment, but people get sanctioned for those reasons all the time. DSHS recently released an internal report after years of ROC telling them that people were getting sanctioned illegally, that says they did a study where they called people in sanction, and the top 3 reasons for being in sanction were childcare issues, transportation issues,
Wow.
medical.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
The $543 for a family of 3 in Washington, what is someone supposed to be able to pay for with that? Housing, or is housing separate?
Housing is not separate. There's 3 different programs. There's food stamps, welfare, and Medicaid. So you can get health care, your $546 a month, and then I'm not sure what the amount for food stamps is for a family of 3, but you are supposed to be able to cover your
rent.
Transportation costs, clothing, housing. The waiting list for subsidized housing in this state is about 5 years long. So,
Wow.
So, go ahead.
I understand that the federal definition of poverty has not been readdressed for decades, and that's part of the reason it's so ridiculously low compared with the real cost of living. Can you?
yeah, you know,
Explain
I'm
that.
not sure about that because I did look up the poverty guidelines recently, and I was looking at the 2005 poverty guidelines, which makes me think that they reevaluate it every year, but I definitely would agree based on, you know, the government's assessment of what it means to be poor and what you can actually accomplish when you're poor. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a lot lower than you actually need.
And just one more question, because this will end up being about policy. Whose decision is it to make the grant for people in Washington 40% of what's defined as poverty? Who's in charge of that $543 decision?
I'm gonna say it's local government in Washington State. The federal
legislature. Yeah, because there's some federal match, there's some federal support, but the state legislature can do, you know, it depends on how much they want to kick in of state funding, besides the small amount from the feds or the modest whatever the amount. So it's our elected officials in the legislature that are doing it, and governors.
But the philosophy comes down through down the staircase that if you give someone enough money to actually live on,
Right.
they won't work. They'll
They won't
prefer to
want
be
to.
on welfare,
Right.
supposedly.
Right.
Now, I want to just follow up on a couple of things about the work requirement. You have to take the first job that's offered to you, and so tell us about that.
Yeah, one of the rules of Work First is that you have to put in X number of hours a week of job search, and that you must take the first job that's offered to you.
And what's that first job that's offered to you likely to be?
Minimum wage, not enough to support your family.
And so what happens if you don't take it? If you say, wait a minute, I can't support
You
my
get
family.
sanctioned.
So what you have to do then is you have to take a job that you know is going to keep your family in poverty.
Yes.
And if you take the job, do you keep your Medicaid and your food stamps?
Depends on how much your job pays. If you take a minimum wage job, you'll still be eligible for Medicaid and food stamps, and might even still be eligible for a small portion of the welfare grant.
Now, you told me on the phone when we were preparing for the show that you hear talk from politicians about needing to give people opportunities for training and education and stuff to get out of poverty. But the reality is that the laws and regulations make it hard to get to school and do that. Does that sink in on politicians, or are they stuck at the level of kind of glib rhetoric?
Yeah, they really are, and I don't think that they know. A lot of times they don't even know how much the welfare grant is. They certainly don't know that the laws set up around education and training or sanctioning or whatever it is are really terrible in the first place, but then go one step down and they aren't even following those rules.
Right.
And they aren't aware of that,
Okay. I want to just do another bit about this stuff, and then we'll get on to some other topics.
Yeah.
But the welfare is sort of the case study or one of the case studies here for thinking about this. You told me about a program under Workforce called High Wage, High Demand, and you mentioned that there's some spottiness as to whether DSHS really knows what their own program is.
This is just one really good example of what's going on in the welfare system in this country. There is a program in Washington State called High Wage, High Demand that says that if you want to go into an occupation that there is demand for and that pays $12 an hour or more, then you can go to school and we'll take care of, it'll fulfill your work requirement, blah, blah, blah. And Monica Peabody, the organizer of ROC, at one point was getting all of these phone calls from people like, I've been trying to do this, and she said, well, don't you know about this program? Well, nobody told me about that program. So finally she called, the director of the CSO, I think it was down in Clark County, who said, oh, no, we don't have that program. And she said, no, I'm looking at the laws right now, and actually you do. So even, all the way up into the upper levels.
Yeah, and that was the head of the whole office for Clark County.
Yeah.
The DSHS office didn't know they had. And then you also mentioned, this is the last thing I want to nail you with here, pick your brain on. You told me on the phone about they've got these quotas and about they have to get a certain percentage of the people holding jobs. And you told me that maybe some of the sanctioning has to do with a way to sort of manipulate the percentage calculations.
Yeah, and
Talk us through that.
There's some controversy here because basically I've talked to caseworkers, former caseworkers who have said in the office that I worked at, we were expected to have an 80% participation rate for Work First, and if that wasn't met, obviously there's pressure.
On the worker, on the employee.
Yeah, because the measure of success of welfare now is how many people are moving off of welfare and into low-paid jobs. And so to me it follows that that may be one of the reasons for not mentioning certain programs to people that could get them out of their work requirement in order to meet that quota. Whereas, I've talked to DSHS officials who say, I don't know anything about a quota. But on the federal level, there is a push for a 50% participation rate.
So your guess is that it may be that sanctioning as a way of getting people off the welfare rolls and denying access to getting education is a way to push to reduce the base number of people in the system, so that when they do the calculation of what percentage are leaving for jobs, they'll have a better percentage calculation.
Yeah, that's my theory. And then they make a graph and they go, look, people are leaving welfare, people are out of poverty. And
yeah, and I never hear the politicians talk about how many people are actually leaving poverty.
Yeah,
how many are getting off the
that's
welfare
not the
roll.
issue.
So it's like, so if this is one example, the welfare as one example of public policy that's been churned around, in the public mind over a number of years, it makes you wonder, for people who have some religious faith or religious values, how do we apply our ethics? How do we apply our values to these things? And when we started this program, we talked about the mixing of there's religion and public policy, and let's talk about how appropriate is this to get our own religious values or our own ethics or our own consciences in play in the world around us. It seems to me like who would not want to live according to our own moral standards, our own religious beliefs?
I think part of the question, though, is, or one way to begin the conversation is to say that public policy decisions are always value-based, whether we identify that or not. So the scenario of if you paid people enough to actually rent a place, then people won't work anymore. There's a value in there. There's a vision of human beings. It's behind that decision. So I don't think the question is necessarily, do we want religious values to be the basis for policy, but how do we affirm values that people hold deeply and not be shy about saying that's why we would advocate for this policy or this policy. At the moment in our country, it's only a certain conservative take of religious values that's claiming that connection. So it's not just switching, I want my religious values. It's to say all those public decisions are value-based. What are the values? What are my values and your values and your values? How do we then create a world based on the values we actually hold? And for some of us, those are religious values, and for some of us, they're ethical values, but they're values.
Well, there are choices to be made, and there are, different values are competing. Then, let's talk for a bit about this book here. Sam and Jerry, both of you have been involved with study groups studying God's politics, and the subtitle is "How the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It," and it seems to relate to from what you're just saying, Emily. Would you tell us something about the book, Sam?
Well, the book is an attempt to deal with these other issues that she is talking about. He's trying to get into the real values of human life and to express a need that reflects a lot of people within the church community or the moral value community. I think that he does a very good job in bringing together a faction of people that were really left out of the 2004 election. And there's a need to develop maybe a movement to express needs that's neither left nor right, but have very deep religious values that many of these people sometimes are just forgotten and ignored.
So in what ways, derived from the subtitle there, in what ways does the right get it wrong?
Well, because they focus on just one or two particular issues, like the homosexual issue or abortion issue, when there's a lot of other issues like poverty and homelessness that many people, I find, are very deeply interested in, and we see it reflected in many of the church communities because they deal with feeding the hungry or clothing people or providing homes for them. In the Olympian, there's always an article or two or a picture about some church that's helping a person with needing a car. Or I read just the other day in the Olympian of a family that came from New Orleans that was, they were helping them find a home and a place for study. They didn't quite feel at Evergreen that was a place for them, so they went to St. Martin's University and felt very much at home there. So there is a need, but I don't always feel, primarily because I think churches just don't trust each other. We just want to take our piece of the cake and try to live within that without getting outside the box, as it were.
And the other part of the subtitle is why the left doesn't get it. It's like, why the right gets it wrong and why the left doesn't get it. Why doesn't the left get it? What's the left
Because
missing?
they separate their religious personal values from policy making.
So they take the separation of church and state too far? They separate too much?
Yes. For instance, the Democrats just seldom. John Kerry, for instance, finally made several comments about his faith at the end of the election, but it was almost too late.
Go ahead.
Can I contribute?
Yeah.
In the book, Wallis says, you have to be suspicious of people who say God is on our side. And I guess Lincoln is quoted as saying, it doesn't matter who we think is on our side, we need to make sure we're on God's side. And I think that's been contaminated in this administration to where they're saying we speak for the religious people of the United States. But the truth is it's kind of a nationalism and not true religion based on values and faith.
It gets to be an idolatry.
Yes.
Of worshiping the nation state and the militarism and the flag. We got flag worship.
Yeah.
I think, as a religion. And the book is available from Sojourners Magazine, or the Sojourners Community, and their website is www.sojo.net, sojo.net, and in bookstores. It's really being well received.
Yes.
Jerry, you told me that one of the things that you liked about it so much was that you found that it was a book of hope.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about that.
This has been a very inspirational book to me, and I picked it up thinking that, I would find somebody that would support the polarism I had. It's so easy to get into these polarized camps. And it really changed my thinking on that, and he says, that cynicism doesn't do any of us any good, and cynicism is a way of lacking commitment. But if you go to hope and look at the fact that there are a whole lot of people that believe the same as we do, it's a matter of connecting those people and then doing actions that would be based on that hope and making things better.
Now, you had taught a class on this at your church.
Yes.
And then you attended that class, and now you're encouraging other people to start their own study groups.
Absolutely.
So the study groups would go for how many sessions?
We went for 9 sessions.
sessions.
I think, Jerry, you went
I
for
went
8.
eight sessions.
Uh-huh.
And I can see it
Yeah.
spinning into a long,
Yeah.
discussion
'Cause
with
after-
people who are really interested.
Yeah, because after you went to the one at his church, then you started one at
Yeah.
your own church.
I was a poor attendee of his. I was on vacation.
Okay, but anyway, but the idea is that this can carry on. People
Oh,
can
yeah.
get the book and just keep perpetuating this.
One of the things that really surprised me about the class that I led in discussion was the desire of people to talk about moral values in public. Most of the time, at least in my history, in my church history, is to keep those things separate. As I told you on the phone, in 45 years of ministry, I don't think I ever preached a political sermon. I certainly talked a lot about moral values and social justice, but I never did it publicly like in a class. We just sort of did it in the parking lot, if that's when we did it, or over coffee. So this was a class to bring those people together who really felt left out of the past election, and I discovered them to be very friendly. The conversation was very uplifting, struggling with basic issues that we all struggle with privately. So as a result of that, I found it to be a very healthy exchange, and I really appreciated that.
So what values do you all have, any of the four of you, that you bring to bear in issues of public concern, whether it's dealing with welfare or war or environment or whatever? What values do you bring that seem to be persistent no matter what issue you're dealing with?
Well, I think the environment, for instance, this is God's creation, and I'm not too sure we look at it as a sacred opportunity to deal with it. I think truth-telling, for instance, is a religious issue. I think that the consistent ethics about human life and the dignity that God has given to each of us because we are created in His image is sometimes just glossed over and ignored.
So that should be a relevant factor when we decide, is it okay for us to torture people that we don't like?
Yeah.
I saw a bumper sticker, by the way. Somebody, downtown Olympia, somebody had a bumper sticker that says, "When Jesus said, 'Love your enemies,' I think He meant, 'Don't kill them.'"
I think that the poverty issue is a core value for me, and as the discrepancy between the wealthy and the very poor gets broader and broader, I think that we need to deal with it from a moral standpoint instead of just a programmatic standpoint. Well, let's slap a few more dollars here and let it go.
A budget has been described as a numerical way of expressing your values. I just find that really a useful concept of thinking about that's what the budget does. It expresses our values in numerical terms. And we look, I know, Emily, with all the concern you have about budget priorities,
I think where I was thinking about your question about values and thinking, I would have to describe my value as a kind of quantitative rationalism that is as simple as saying every person on the planet is entitled to water, food, shelter, basic medical care, a loving family, and opportunities to do good work in the world. That's it. Everybody's entitled to that. That's my value. And it's quantitative, because if we then said, wow, maybe everybody should have access to water, there's a lot of policy decisions we need to make and remake in order to make that happen. And so the older I get and the more worried I get about the huge conflicts between the decisions we're making and the consequences of our actions and the, Jerry, as you said, the inequities and the distributions of wealth, all in the context of an environmental crisis that is just getting worse. I think I just have to go back to this really basic notion. It's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the UN, came through the UN in the 40s. It just says, hey, everybody deserves something. Now, what do we do? Because the way we've rationed it is wildly out of proportion. So budgets either reflect our effort to move in that direction, or they just are snapshots of how we think, no, that person's only worth that much, but this person's really worth this much, and that family's only worth $500. You can't rent an apartment for $500. So where do you go for 5 years? I'm still worried about that.
Yeah. Homelessness is a concern that all of us share, and I know you've worked locally on that, and you told me on the phone when we were preparing for the program that we're just not solving the problem. We do some charity,
Right.
but that's not sufficient. So tell us that angle.
Well, charity is relatively easy because you can dig in something you own and give a little away, but retain the majority. But justice is what we're talking about in this whole program, is justice for everyone that's equal justice. And in this country, the people at the bottom do not get equal justice. The justice, I don't know who it's saved for. I think probably people at the top who are able to break the law. And they don't get justice either. They kind of scoot away. So, it's a great theory, but it's hard to have programs that are just as Crystal was talking about. Those aren't just programs.
Yeah, and then they're even applied unjustly.
Yes.
I mean, so tell us the story about how your church happened to end up offering place, and we're running kind of tight on time, so we want to keep this tight because there's a lot more good stuff I want to cover.
Sure.
But
It was kind of a spontaneous grace experience where when I first came here in the early 90s, I discovered that there were homeless people. A lot of people, because they were homeless or hungry, came to Olympia because of the state capitol and other federal agencies that were located here. As a result of that, a lot of them came through and by the church. And so I contacted the mayor and several other people, and we decided that we would have some kind of a gathering, and we held it at the United Church. And we spent a full day with homeless people and people from United Way, from the federal government, from the state government, and from the city government. And we did the typical kind of thing you do in that kind of a conference. You put a lot of stuff up on newsprint. And we had this newsprint all over the wall. Near the end of it, I happened to be moderating what was going on to conclude it, and a woman stood up and she said, "Pastor Sam, we appreciate what you've done with all these insights and ideas, but could all of you look outside?" And we turned and looked outside, and it was snowing and raining. And then she said, "Can somebody tell me where I can sleep tonight?" And I thought, wow, it's good to put ideas up on the paper, but do the ideas ever take feet and actually become a reality? So Gene Hoover was with me that day, or in that group, and he said, Pastor Sam, if you'll give me the key to the front door of your church, I will supervise these people tonight. And so 5 people came that night. And that really began it. I had to run upstairs and tell the chairman of my board of trustees, guess what I did, Rex? And then the newspaper picked that up and gave some good information on what was happening. And we had anywhere from 90 to 150 people in our church every night for almost 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's a great challenge to the congregation and a challenge to the community.
Yes.
And a great model.
Yes.
So thank you for doing that.
One of the people, a significant person in the community and in our church, came to me during that and said, you know, Pastor Sam, I've learned more Bible lessons in working with the homeless in the last 6 months than I have the whole time that I've been studying in school.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a bit more. We are kind of tight on time, but I want us to look at some other examples about how our own values differ from public policy. And we've briefly mentioned war, but I think we ought to, and violence, but we ought to just address that again a bit. What values do we have? And this may be self-evident, but I think it just needs to get said. How do our values differ from the government's use of war and violence? What are the values that we have in us? Our religious values, our conscience, our ethics?
I think what Emily said encompassed it all, what everybody is entitled to, and violence isn't a part of that vision, that box. You know, and to think that we can use violence as a remedy is pretty short-term thinking, because then someone else is going to break out in violence when that remedy doesn't work.
As we're seeing in Iraq and so many other places. In the fall of 2001, Dick Cheney said, this is right after the September 11, Dick Cheney says, we're dealing with dirty people. We have to be prepared to get dirty ourselves. And I thought, this is not rooted in moral values.
No, it's
not. This is not ethics. No. This is something else going on.
Yeah, see, this is a politician who sees himself better than somebody else. And he just isn't. He may be in a different position and a power position, but fundamentally, in the eyes of God, I'd say he's no better than anybody else.
You told me on the phone, Jerry, that we need to reject the myth of redemptive violence. Tell us what redemptive violence concept is.
Just that, you know, violence will solve a problem, and you are entitled to do it. I think that's what the Cheney thing is about. These are dirty people. It's okay to be violent with them because we will get redemption for doing it. Uh-huh. I'm not sure that's real clear, but...
Okay. There are a lot of human rights issues. I'm active in working to end the death penalty, and a lot of the people who work to abolish the death penalty come at it from moral and religious and ethical reasons. Some people come at it from the standpoint of justice, you know, the legal system, that this really is unjust in terms of legalities. Other people come at it because the death penalty is so biased in terms of race and economic class and mental disability and so many other ways. I mean, all this equality that you're looking for is missing in the death penalty. And it just seems like that's an issue where people have ethics from so many different directions, including a lot of religious and values that say this is just wrong, it's not our business to be doing that. I'm thinking, what other moral issues out there that our own values address?
I think the choices that we're making right now about development in Thurston County, for instance, are actual moral and ethical choices. Because if we say we value water for everyone, then we'd have to say what conditions need to hold for the water to be here and to be clean generation, generation, generation. And so it's odd to think about growth management acts in terms of moral and ethical choices, but in fact, what we decide to do today has huge impacts on the generations that are going to come after us, and those are ethical choices, I think.
So, do we have another example, or is there something else that's in our minds?
To me, it's the difference between thinking today and tomorrow versus 2 or 3 generations ahead. And I think that one of the moral things we're doing to our children and grandchildren and their children is we are raising the deficit of the federal government so high that we are passing that down to those generations, and I would consider that very immoral.
And also, Jonathan Kozel's new book about apartheid in the United States documents the difference in spending in public education on kids. So not only are we passing on a deficit that will control the budget, but also it comes on top of huge inequities in spending in terms of our public policies. And it's staggering. That's where I think any conversation about hope versus cynicism is important, because there's plenty of grounds for cynicism.
So if those of you who've been working with this book find that as a measure of hope as opposed to just cynicism, then that's something to be pursued. One of the things that I thought would be interesting for the viewers after this program is over is to notice what's in the newspaper, what news items, and you've mentioned some current in the news kinds of things, and look at what's in the news and think, what are the moral issues involved? What are the public policy issues? How do my values connect with this issue about whether it's an economic issue or an environmental or whatever?
The recent newspaper just reported that 4,000 more children are going to be eligible for basic health care in Washington State, which is terrific, except the need that's documented is 25,000. So,
yeah. So what do we want? What do we want instead of what we're getting? And it sounds like there's certainly a strong role for applying religious values and moral values and ethics and conscience and so forth to public policy, but doing it without contaminating the church and state thing. I think you told me that Bush is the commander-in-chief, not the theologian-in-chief.
Right.
That was an interesting aspect.
Right.
But somehow we need to be able to have in the public arena the conversation that you mentioned earlier in the program that seemed to happen at your church when you discussed this book, where people actually could have civilized dialogue and hear each other. So tell us some of your vision for what kind of conversations our society needs.
Well, Jim Wallis is really interested in creating a movement. And he said the way you do that is to change the wind, the direction of the wind, because politicians follow the direction of the wind. That is what's happening at the local level. I was pleased by my local Congressman Baird, who sent me a questionnaire last week of 8 or 10 basic issues. Do you agree, disagree, or undecided? And it gave me an opportunity to give some input. That's on a political issue, but I also think there's an opportunity for people just of moral value to begin speaking very directly and as carefully as they possibly can, hoping that somehow out of the spontaneity of the conversation, a movement. I've often said maybe America is in need for a third party. I don't know how that would happen. I have no idea how even to begin that. But I think there are plenty of people in America who are morally grounded, who just don't feel like what's happening now or has happened in the past is really getting the job done. What really shocked me was Katrina that hit New Orleans. I had sort of had this idea that the war on poverty solved a lot of that problem. And though I've worked with poor people and homeless people for years, I just was overtaken by the fact that this really happened here in our country. Something is not as haywire, is not put together there.
I think in that case, I think it's the public policy of this current Bush administration that the government should be a government that does not help people. I mean, that's their agenda, is to get the government out of the helping people business, and so you're on your own, or you have to rely on the churches or charity or something. And I think people got a rude awakening to see, look how awful that is when the government says, we don't care about you anymore. I think that was the rude awakening, I think, that people got. You told me on the phone when we were preparing for the show about having these conversations, but doing it without having people label each other, and I thought that was a good approach.
Yeah, we have a tendency to do that. If I can label you, then I can dismiss you, rather than dialogue. In other words, I feel that we need to work toward a pathway, not a solution.
Okay.
I think we need to put our feet together in a pathway. It doesn't mean that all of us have to line up and agree on, on those issues, but there are some fundamental values that I think we need to join hands and to move forward in resolving that.
And Crystal, the work that you do is so hands-on and direct with people's just real realities. And on the phone, you mentioned that you wanted to make sure that the people watching this program realize that the policies actually affect real life people. It's not just the theoretical stuff.
When you don't experience it in your day-to-day life, it's really easy to look at the new budget that Congress has approved and go, wow, that's really lame, that's really horrible, we're denying help to people. But suddenly when you either find yourself in that situation or, like me, are on the other end of a phone or at the office where you hear these stories every day, I'm getting evicted and I have these health problems and there's no help for me. There's nothing that I can do about it.
Yeah. So that seems like that's part of the process, is to make sure that the people who are affected by public policy actually participate in the public discussion. So just like the case you said where at the United Churches when the meeting was being held and there were homeless people present and talking about homeless.
And
likewise,
that's the whole point of ROC.
And ROC really does engage people in their own advocacy and their own organizing, which is wonderful. We should put in a plug for ROC so people know how to contact them. We have just a few minutes left, but I want to make sure people do know how to contact ROC. They have a phone in Olympia at 360-352-9716, and they have a website, www.wroc.org. And so they certainly deserve support and interaction, and it's good for not only people who receive public assistance or people who are poor, but allies who want to work with them on that. There's great folks. I have just a couple minutes left. I want to make sure people know that book is available in bookstores.
Yes.
And from the Sojourner's website, www.sojo.net. You're looking at a process of continuing workshop. You're
right.
I'm encouraging other people. Tell us what you have in mind for other people to.
I would like to see other churches and other organizations within the Olympia area offer classes, discussion groups, whatever you want to call it, on God's politics. And there's a leader's guide available, and Sam has done the class. He has an outline. I've done the class. I have a shaky outline. But we certainly would share those, and maybe eventually we'll get enough people who've read it and who are fired up about it that maybe we could have a meeting of all of those people and just discuss, things that we can do to remedy what we currently seem to be living with.
Yeah. Okay. We can take like a closing thought from each person. So.
Yeah, I would just say that these are all really important issues, and it is great to sit down and read books written by people, but there's so much immediately that can be done to get in contact with one of the many amazing organizations we have in Olympia and start those conversations. You don't have to do a lot of reading and do a lot of academic work to understand and care about and act on these issues.
Okay, great. Thanks. Sam, briefly?
Well, I one of the things I try to, in approaching this, is do it with reflection, with a sense of accountability, and with humility.
Great. Thank you so much. Emily, briefly?
Just like Crystal, I would also encourage people even to volunteer for an hour a month at the Bread and Roses Advocacy Center, answering phones, and get to talk to people and hear what is happening in our community.
Okay, thanks. Jerry?
I would say that one of the things that bothers me, because I worked with Bread and Roses back in the 80s, and I got to know a lot of the people we fed, a lot of them are still here. So to me, that means we're giving them charity, and now we need to work on the justice issue.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Well, thanks to Crystal Lorentzson and Sam Hochstatter and Emily Lardner and Jerry Smith. I want to thank all the folks who've been watching. For information about a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolence, you can contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 491-9093. You can also call that number and we can give you the referrals to the organizations and resources we've talked about. We're all one human family. We all share this one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs your help. Thank you.
Thank you.